Should the U.S. Department of Education be abolished? That's one of the questions that the new presidential administration and the new Congress may grapple with in 2025. But what does this mean for a broader education policy agenda for the next 4 years?
Because shutting it down is a legislative issue, the question is, how should it be used while it exists?
On this episode, we sit down with the experts to hear different approaches to federal education policy, what that might mean for states, and why principles like federalism, education choice, and parental involvement should factor into the discussion. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about education, specifically what an education policy agenda for the country and the state of Utah could or should look like in 2025 and beyond. And to start off this conversation, I'm very excited for our guest today joining us in the virtual studio. His name is Max Eden, and he's a senior fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. Max, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Yeah, thanks for having me here.
Max, I'm excited to talk to you because you research and write about and talk about education policy, and one of the big questions kind of on the minds of folks who have been following things happening at the national level ever since the outcome of the election is whether or not the United States should get rid of the Federal Department of Education. You wrote a really excellent piece on this recently for the Washington Examiner, actually, that we'll link to in the show notes for our listeners. But you kind of have an interesting take on it, and so I want to get into that. But maybe first, if I can ask you a general question. There's a lot of things that we've heard about what President-elect Trump has promised to do in a second term. We, of course, will have a new Congress coming into power, and the Republicans will have unified control of government at the federal level. So maybe just sort of a first question of what's sort of your gut reaction to all these developments happening at the national level? Of course, the selection of Linda McMahon to be the education secretary in the Trump administration. What's kind of your gut reaction of all of this? How should we be thinking about these things as we look at these developments in the coming months?
Yeah, I think that we should be looking at them with great hope and optimism, frankly. I think that a lot of the Trump campaign victory in general and education policy in particular was powered by a lot of swing voters flipping over back to his column or to his column for the first time because they felt as though there was a kind of a stultifying orthodoxy that was strangling various aspects of American life, and education, in my opinion, being kind of maybe the most pointed of them, from what we saw on campus after October 7th to what we've been seeing in schools in K-12 and either DEI or gender identity issues. The sense that, you either need to do exactly what we say and think exactly what we think, or else you deserve to be out of society. I think that's been broken culturally, and I think that the policy levers that were used to advance that, many of which came out of the Department of Education, will be, if not fully dismantled, because we can talk about that in a second, but certainly kind of pared back or retooled. So I think the vibe, as the kids say, is very positive and optimistic. Regarding Linda McMahon, she's not the most known quantity in policy circles, but she is, by all appearances, a very successful and shrewd businesswoman. She is, by all appearances, very aligned and loyal to President Trump. And so if the question is, do we have a secretary who we have good reason to expect will fulfill on Donald Trump's campaign promises? The answer seems to be yes. I think there's kind of a lot of excitement about that.
Well, let's jump into that first big question. Again, President-elect Trump has said that he wants to abolish the Department of Education. This is something that has been touted by many previous Republican presidents. I want to read an excerpt from a piece that you wrote titled, "Trump Should Use the Education Department, Not Abolish It." It was an op-ed you wrote for the Washington Examiner that's also on the AEI website that we'll, again, share the link in the show notes. But Max, in this piece, you say, old school conservatives want federal restraint, but an ascendant populist wing wants to see the education department punch back twice as hard. Rather than pursue administrative peace by unilateral disarmament, the next Republican president could seek de-escalation through escalation. if you can't get the Republican votes to shut down the department, make the Democrats resent it so much that they want to shut it down too. Now, you go through and articulate a couple of specifics, but I wonder, can you just expand on that concept? That what would you suggest to the administration of essentially how they should use the Department of Education if they're not actually going to push to shut it down immediately?
Sure, absolutely. And I should begin with by, I'm sympathetic to the goal of shutting down the Department of Education. In a better country, it would not exist. And I think as well as, hopefully many of your listeners would like to live in a better country where it did not exist. But in the short run, it would take 60 votes in the Senate to do that. And Republicans have at most 53 if every Republican goes along. So shutting it down is unfortunately just not on the radar right now, right? So the general idea that I was going for in the piece, and then I'm happy to talk through any number of policy specifics, is because shutting it down is a legislative issue, the question is, how should it be used while it exists? How should the Trump administration use it? And, another way to put what I said in the piece is, for a long time, conservatives/Republicans have had both a principled reason to not like the Department of Education and many policy reasons. Democrats have no principled reason to dislike the Department of Education and haven't really had many policy-related reasons to either. And so if you want to shut down the department, it needs to be a bipartisan thing at this point, unless Republicans get 60-plus votes in the Senate. So, it's maybe churlish to say, but the best way to bipartisanship is to give Democrats a reason to not like this agency, to make them resent it for some of the same reasons that Republicans have. So that's, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's also not, because I'll give you, one example of what I think the Trump department should not do, hence I didn't put it in the piece, but could do and would be entirely proportionate with what President Biden and his administration did, right? President Trump could use the Federal Department of Education to ban books in school libraries. Now, should he? I've certainly been on kind of the pro-library curation side. I think there are many books that make their way into school libraries that are inappropriate, that local and, state, particularly local school boards would be well advised to take out. I don't really want President Trump or the Trump Department of Education saying you must ban these books. But the Biden Department of Education used its Office of Civil Rights to threaten school districts that were using a normal review process to see, do these books contain what we believe to be pornography? Is the explicit content of these books worth it? These local decisions that were being made, the Biden Office of Civil Rights kind of came in and said, if you make what we don't like, if you make the wrong decisions, we might take away all of your money. So that would be, something I wouldn't want to see the Trump administration do for a variety of reasons, but would be the exact kind of thing that conservatives and Republicans have faced from Democrat administrations. So that's maybe one ultra, thing that I wouldn't want to have happen that I think is illustrative, but I'm happy to talk through any sorts of things that I do think should happen with you as well, which I think would be things that would be policy victories for Republicans, conservatives, frankly, I think for the center, but would be resented by the activist left and therefore by many Democrats in Congress.
Max, you're touching on something that I think ties into a broader principle that I want to get your thoughts on, and it's this idea of if there is something that exists at the federal level that maybe is an example of government overreach or federal overreach, then the question is, well, how do you rein it in? We've had some other conversations on this show in the past, specifically kind of about the concept of federalism, of that principle, that kind of the broad view among a lot of folks, not necessarily everyone, but that the federal government in many respects is too big, it's too far-reaching, and that we need to rein that in a little bit. And this seems to kind of be in that theme of federalism. I guess my question for you on that point specifically is, when I've tried this line of argument, with friends of mine or family members who have a different view of the use of federal authority on issues like education and other policy areas, if I'm trying to make the case that, hey, if you and I agree for different reasons that at times the federal government is way too overreaching, then can't we agree that we need to just reduce the size and scope of the federal government and send a lot of these functions back to the states? Essentially, let's strengthen federalism, even if we're sort of motivated by different things. And that you would hope, to your point, would be bipartisan, that some folks who are very, upset about the Trump victory would say, well, if we could rein in the federal government, we'd be less worried about what his administration would do. Same with folks on the other side. But the response that I've heard from folks is sometimes not that. It's more so, well, we just need to make sure we have the right people in place sort of using these levers of power to do good things rather than trying to restructure this power and send more power back to the states. What's your sense of that? Is there a risk that that's just what's going to happen with this specific issue, the Department of Education, or how would we navigate that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I totally understand the back and forth that you described that you've had with people. I've had similar backs and forths as well, and I think that people are much more sympathetic to federalism and kind of laboratories of democracy as an abstract idea when it comes to kind of technocratic management and policy issues that they don't have a firm grasp on, and far less inclined to believe it because it's a little bit harder generally to believe when it comes to issues that you think are of grave moral import. I mean, Abraham Lincoln basically said, if I mean the logic behind Lincoln's argument was if slavery is wrong somewhere, it's wrong everywhere, and if it's wrong, then it's wrong. This is not an issue that should be left up to the states. And so when it comes to moral issues, it's become frankly harder for me to, as somebody who's very pro-federalism, very pro-devolution, to accept the kind of the pragmatic argument for a neutral federal stance, right? To take one issue in concrete particular that the Department of Education played a massive role in pushing in one way and then didn't in the first Trump administration, the issue of kind of gender identity and transgender ideology, depending on how you prefer to speak of it, in K-12 schools. This was not, an organic issue that bubbled up. The different states and school districts came to their independent decisions on. This was an issue where the Obama Department of Education came in and said, if you don't do exactly what we say you should do on bathroom access, on sports probably, on general accommodations, then we'll take away your money. Now, the first time around, Trump came in and he said, all right, I don't think this is a civil rights issue. I think this is a people issue. I think people should figure out amongst themselves. I'm just going to not do that. We're going to pare that back. The Biden folks come in, they do the exact same thing, and they do it much harder, which has left a lot of people kind of on the right, on the center, especially the more this issue has unfolded, the more people really, I think, are changing their minds about it. When it just seemed like it was about bathrooms, it was one thing. When it's about suggesting to a kindergarten student that they might be born of the wrong body and maybe they should look into these, medications to arrest puberty, people have a very different reaction to that. And so now the question is, all right, well, the federal government started this. The federal government took a very strong moral stance and pushed it. And then last time we basically had a pause and a concerted push. So what should the federal government do this time around? Should it just say, we're going to stop pushing it? Or should it, say we're going to do what the Democrats did, but the exact opposite? And as I said in my piece, and twice as hard. And we don't know exactly what McMahon will do, but certainly Trump campaigned on kind of a rhetoric of that. And so I think there will be some very interesting, discussions and debates within each side, much less between both sides, on federalism, right? Would the Democrats regret having pushed this issue in this way because of where it might ultimately end up? On the one hand, on the other hand, when it comes to other things around how schools manage their accountability systems, how school choice programs unfold, how schools manage discipline, those are all areas where, President Trump hasn't campaigned on as much on this is what the federal agenda is going to be. Those are issues that are a little bit more core to the idea of devolution and sending it back to the states. And so I think that, when it comes to the culture war issues, as one will, around gender identity, around critical race theory, DEI, I think we're likely and almost bound to see an aggressive federal stance, which might not be what federalist inclined people dream of or would prefer, but I think is kind of where you get to when you see it being violated so much from one side. And the hope is that in the long run, this won't be a scorched earth war where, one side gets 40 yards when they have power and the other side gets 40 yards when they're out of power. But that 1 or 2 terms of this kind of similar governance to what we've seen from the Democrats, but from the other side, will ultimately turn the temperature down on these issues as federal issues and make them more genuinely state and local discretion, prudence determinations.
Let's expand on that last point a little bit because, again, kind of following along your line of argument that there's a long game to this, which is essentially more education federalism. Again, something as President Trump said during the campaign, sending education back to the states. And even in his first term, the administration was supportive of school choice. So I want to start to get into some of those and kind of get your take on that. If, again, with that long game of if there's a successful effort to by whatever mechanism, if it's the kind of thing you're describing or whatever other mechanisms to reduce the size and scope of the federal presence on education policy and send more of it back to states. Education choice is one that, of course, has been a big issue in recent years. We've seen a lot of states adopt education choice policies, especially since the pandemic. Here in Utah, we recently passed something called the Utah Fits All Scholarship that helps move in that direction to further empower parents. What do you see as the impact of maybe championing these things at the state level? Is this kind of the next step? Is it step one, let's curtail the federal government a little bit, and then step two, states have the opportunity and the responsibility to step up on things like education choice? How would you map that out, and what would you recommend, I guess, to policymakers at the state level in that circumstance?
No, absolutely. I mean, the past few years, we've seen just incredible progress in school choice, universal school choice. If you had asked me 4 years ago, how many states do you think will have universal school choice in a decade? I would have told you one if we're lucky, two if we're super blessed, right? And now we have, depending on how you count it, 12. And we have that not because the Biden administration championed school choice, although I would not be opposed to the Trump administration championing school choice for, reasons I could get into for a while, but because, in some ways, what the Biden administration did on schools and their overreaching violations of federalism, especially on cultural and moral issues, I think really lit a fire under a lot of parents and therefore a lot of state legislators to say, wait, I don't want to be forced to send my kid to a school where Washington can dictate the fundamental moral valence from a distance. I should at least have an option to not do that. And so, state after state, up to 12 states, depending on the kind of have done that. There are a couple more states that are on the brink. One thing we didn't see from the Trump administration the first time around, but I'm hoping to see this time around, it's still too soon to tell, it would be for Secretary McMahon or whomever she has as her assistant secretaries or various things to actually go to states and to advocate on behalf of particular bills, to highlight particular bills. I was talking with a Utah state legislator the other day, Ryan Wilcox, who was talking about the great work that he's done on school safety. And that's work that, as far as I can tell from a distance, seems remarkable. But when you have 50 states, you can't identify everything that's remarkable that's going on. So if you had a federal government that saw its role less as I'm going to command that all of these states must follow my policies on things, but took more of there are a few things that I'm going to advocate directly to states that these states should do themselves. And I'm also going to highlight things that are happening in states that I think deserve more attention and more praise and should be picked up. Then there is a way that the Department of Education, the Secretary of Education, the Assistant Secretary for Outreach could really accomplish a lot of policy goals, not by forcing anybody to do anything, but by advocating for them to, by encouraging for them to, by praising people who do things well. And so from school choice to school safety to school discipline to the science of reading to improving phonics instruction to changing math instruction to better kind of more quote unquote patriotic and certainly more knowledge rich social studies standards. There are all sorts of things that the federal government just doesn't have the tools to even try to force states to do it well. But if there was more of a culture about it, if your governor or state legislator, as they've started to learn about choice, they've started to realize, wait, if I pass this bill, I'm going to get national praise. Everybody's going to be saying, like, Spencer Cox signed this wonderful bill. Isn't he great? Isn't he one of the leaders in the country? Governors love that stuff. Not to speak to Cox in particular, but governors in general love national praise. And it's a tool that we haven't really seen a Secretary of Education or a presidential administration use in education, is just simply highlighting and praising states that are doing things that, you know, align with their policy goals and ambitions.
Max, there's a framework that comes to mind just hearing you articulate this, and in some of the other conversations we've had on this issue. I would describe it this way, that I'm sure is a gross oversimplification, but I want to ask you if this is sort of the right, very simple framework to think through this. Is number one, the federal government should focus on empowering states, and then number two, states should focus on empowering parents. And so that starts to tie into things like education choice and parent access to learning materials. But is that sort of the right, again, very simplified framework? Federal government empower states, states empower parents.
Yes, I mean it is, and here's also why it is, right? President Trump, and I approve of his policy, most of his rhetoric around this, but I think conservatives have really gotten into this idea that it should be sent back to the states, and that's what you'll hear President Trump say: "Send it back to the states," right? But before the federal government really started stepping into this game in a big way around No Child Left Behind in particular, it's not as though the states really were these like policy powerhouses, right? The Constitution delegated these duties to the states, and the states, granted further delegations to local school districts with the ideas that, schools would be held democratically accountable by parents. And that has gotten miffed in all sorts of ways. But the idea of sending something back to the states is not so that the states can necessarily become these overweighting powerhouses in themselves, but it's just so you can start to undo the weird power imbalance that has taken the power over education, both, especially public and in some cases private too. If you undo the imbalance that has taken it further away from having schools that align with the preferences and values and desires and aspirations of local parents with their children.
Well, to that point, and we've talked about education choice, it seems that one of the things that comes up is having an awareness of what parents are choosing between as far as different options they're looking at. And I'm curious to your thoughts. One of the things that we've pushed here in Utah, again, with our education policy fellow, Christine Fairbanks on our team here at Sutherland, is this idea of a parent-driven education, that should be the principle that sort of drives education policy here in Utah. And part of that is having better parent access to learning materials. So curriculum, essentially what the experience is, what the kids are learning in schools, empowering parents to have better access to information for that, which again can help them be more engaged in their kids' education just while they're in school, can also help give some better information so that the parents can choose the right environment for their kids. But I'm curious to your thoughts on that. Do you see sort of this parent-driven education principle with parent access policies as sort of a companion piece to education choice? And is that all downstream of what we're talking about, of states, after being empowered by the federal government, being able to further empower parents?
Again, yes, and I'll just explain a few additional reasons to kind of the principles you articulated, why I think that's exactly spot on, frankly. I mean, to go back, longer than our 15-minute political memories that we all have these days. But, the original, actually, the original thing that Trump really campaigned on in 2016, and he got Republicans like Jeb Bush off of something that they had previously supported, frankly, was being against the Common Core, right? And why was President Trump in 2016? Why were so many kind of conservatives, Republicans, but also just like parents, really? And it looks like a partisan issue, but I don't really think it's a partisan issue, because the real problem with the Common Core, and we could have hours of discussion on this, but the real problem was it was revealed in this survey by a very pro Common Core think tank, where it showed that 70% of elementary school parents thought it was harder to help their kids with math homework after the Common Core, right? Like, it just made it hard for parents to do what they want to do to help their kids learn. It was, the anti-parent empowerment curricular initiative, right? So the question really should be, how do you get parents, or how do you foster a paradigm where parents aren't confused, they aren't out of the loop, they aren't unable to help, but they're right there with their kid, not doing the kid's homework directly, but able to help, and where the student feels as though the parents and the teachers are both on the same team to drive, learning forward for that child. And you articulated, I think, a bunch of the things. I mean, academic transparency should be a no-brainer. It polls incredibly well. We saw a bunch of bills introduced to it. You see the teachers' unions fight against it. You see a lot of school districts claim falsely, by the way, and the Trump Department of Education can make it a campaign out of this, falsely, that somehow copyright prevents schools from sharing materials with parents. It doesn't, but they want to say that it does. So, parents need to know what's going on in their kids' schools, first, so they can help. Second, so they can broadly review. And then third, they need to know what their other options are. I mean, one thing that I think we have seen become extremely popular in places where it starts to become available is classical education, which is something that, at first apparent, like, it might sound a little bit elitist, it might sound a little bit snotty, a little bit out there, but really it's, knowledge-rich, rigorous math in K through 6 and great books in middle school and high school. Just, if you're gonna force a kid to stay in school K through 12, you might as well put a bunch of things that this kid should know together so that he forms or she forms a base of knowledge. And then B, instead of exposing them to trendy books, to the book of the month from the Oprah Book Club, expose them to timeless things and really challenge them and expand their mind. And this is something that I think it's still in its infancy of import, but in places like Arizona and Florida and Texas, and I would imagine, Utah, I'm less familiar with the situation on the ground there, but once parents really start to understand it, which they won't until they see schools around it and they talk to people with it, it's one thing to read an article, it's another thing to really know. But I think that, there are things that many parents want for their child that once they know what they're actually getting and know what it actually is also out there for them, will help them make decisions that they will love, their children will love, and will help them flourish because that partnership exists between, the set of teachers, the teacher, the school, and the parents.
Max, the last question I want to ask you before we wrap up, and chime in if there's anything we missed that you want to make sure you're able to touch on before we finish. But my last question for you is kind of a magic wand question. If you could wave a magic wand to kind of see any developments in education policy happen at the federal level or the state level over the next 4 years, what would those be? And maybe a more pointed way to to ask the question is, if President Trump and congressional leadership came to you and said, we will all do whatever you think we should do in education policy, what would you like to see over the next 4 years? And if, for example, in Utah or in other states or states like Utah, if leadership came to you and said, what should we do at the state level? What would be your ideal sort of education policy wins over the next 4 years, nationally and in the states?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk to you for hours about that, so I'll try to keep it short. I mean, one thing that I would like to see is and this will sound negative, but it's a positive thing. I would like to see diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of put on the ash heap of history and broadly regretted as an ideological episode in American public education, American life in general. And that, I think, could happen if the Trump administration takes a very careful look at the Students versus Harvard decision, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, which was on the one hand ostensibly around discrimination in admissions. But I'll tell you, if you pull that decision up, I would invite any of your listeners to read the decisions. One of those popular decisions, the Supreme Court in recent history. Pull the decision up, Apple F the word stereotyping, and you will see mention after mention after mention after mention of how the government cannot engage in odious stereotyping, putting forward the shameful suggestion that just because people look one way, they think one way. That is just written all over that decision. It's written all over other decisions. I would love to see that decision put to full use, right? That, my opponents might say I'd like to see it weaponized, but I'd like to see it fully used to say that, what, schools and colleges cannot proactively engage in stereotyping through government speech by sending racially coded message about what is whiteness, what is blackness, what is white privilege, what is, all of that stuff, I think, currently is unconstitutional. I think that the arguments around, is it equity? Is it diversity? Is it anti-racism? I think it's all unconstitutional, and I think it should be remembered as unconstitutional. So that's the first thing that I would like to see, and I think could be done. And once Americans really understand a question, understand its constitutional import, we change our minds on it, right? When it's just like, oh, are you for or against diversity? Sure, I'm for diversity. Well, are you for or against racial stereotyping? I guess I'm against racial stereotyping. Oh, well, the racial stereotyping is unconstitutional. Are you for something that's unconstitutional? No, of course not. Of course I'm not for unconstitutional things. So I think the social and cultural issues that we've seen really define the debates around education can be settled. I won't get into it at length, but I think that a lot of stuff around gender could be settled in a similar way around First Amendment free exercise, 14th Amendment, substantive and procedural due process questions. So I'd like to get those issues, frankly, out of the way so that I could see this administration maybe take the schools that serve military students, transform them into classical schools, use that transformative process to highlight classical education across the country, use maybe both the federal tax code through legislation and reconciliation, or certainly advocacy to encourage the number of states embracing school choice to go from 12 to 24 states. And if we could have in 4 years later a public system of education in America that parents didn't have to feel might subvert their fundamental values to send their kids to, and we could see half the country having parents have the liberty and freedom to choose their education options and real options being highlighted for them so that they can understand them, that's what I'd love to see.
Well, Max, that's our time together today with you. We'll leave it there, and thank you for your time and expertise and kind of walking through some of these issues. And of course, we'll have to watch how things unfold in the coming months and years to see what kinds of developments there are in education policy federally and at the state level. And again, just thank you very much for your time being with us on Defending Ideas.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Once again, that was Max Eden, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he works on education policy. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to continue this conversation with our very own Christine Cooke Fairbanks and dive into some more details about pros and cons, about getting rid of the Federal Department of Education, and also what this general sort of push of federalism from the government in Washington might mean for states like Utah when it comes to things like parent access and curriculum transparency and school choice. So more to come right after this break. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn, and we're going to continue our conversation about education policy in 2025 and beyond with a new administration at the federal level and a new Congress, and what that means for education policy nationally and at the state level. And to expand on the conversation, I'm pleased to welcome to our virtual studio Christine Cooke Fairbanks. She is our Education Policy Fellow here at Sutherland Institute. Christine, welcome back to the show.
Nick, thank you for having me.
Christina, I want to talk to you about this issue because you have written and spoken about sort of the federal role in education a number of times here at Sutherland, and you've really kind of tried to convey in my mind what is sort of just a principled framework for policymakers at the national level and at the state level that I think is always a helpful reminder whenever we're having these big conversations about what should education policy look like moving forward for the state, for the nation. And so I want to first kind of get your overall reaction to what's been happening at the national level, everything we've been talking about with Linda McMahon being named the new education secretary or the nominee for education secretary from President Trump, the commotion or the discussion around getting rid of the Federal Department of Education, all of those kinds of things. Just in general, what's your gut reaction to those kinds of conversations and how should we be thinking about them moving forward?
I think that what's been put forward so far, sort of the goals of this administration, could be a big win for the learning of individual students, which is the goal of education policy, right? So all of the things that have been mentioned, in the Truth Social announcement, where he named his who he's nominated for the Secretary of Education, he said he wants to send education back to the states. So if that's true, that's a big win. And it certainly touches on this principle of federalism that you've mentioned that at Sutherland Institute we talk a lot about. It's really important that things that belong to the states stay with the states, and education has traditionally been one of those. We've kind of gotten away from that over time, but I think there's more and more of an appetite to bring that back to the states, back to the family and parent level. So I see this as having a lot of potential for being a big victory for education.
I want to ask you about a couple of the specifics to expand on a little bit, but first I want to read a segment from a piece that you wrote for the Sutherland Insights blog recently. The title is, "Could Trump's Second Term Forever Change Federal Education Policy?" We'll link to it in the show notes so our folks can go out and read it as well. But in this Insights piece, you write, "Federal involvement in education is arguably not contemplated by the U.S. Constitution, and yet federal influence in education has grown over time, with unimpressive outcomes. Conservatives for years have advocated for states to be free of federal intervention in education policy and have resented the department." In this case, talking about the Department of Education on the federal level. So, Christine, I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit. Again, this principle of federalism, of maybe an oversimplified way to kind of boil it down is, should the role of the federal government be, when it comes to education, to just empower states and then states empower parents? Or kind of what's your take on federalism in general and how we can apply that to education? And then I'd love to get your thoughts specifically on how does that apply to, in this case, the debate over the Department of Education? What would be the pros and cons of getting rid of that department on the federal level?
Yeah, the U.S. Constitution doesn't talk about education, and then obviously the 10th Amendment says that whatever's not mentioned here, enumerated, goes to the states. So that's where I say it traditionally has been understood as an as a state's issue. That being said, there's a long history of the federal government getting involved to some degree or another in education policy. And there's always been this tension about federalism. How much do we want the federal government to be involved, right? Maybe they have an appropriate role in research, right? They could just promote best practices, but there's no real lever or requirement or anything like that. And so some of those might be appropriate. And I think that's where this debate has come from. As early as 1867, you had President Andrew Johnson signed legislation creating the first Department of Education. And then almost immediately the next year, it was demoted to an Office of Education, because even then they were nervous that there was going to be too much federal intervention and interference in the local schools. And then from there, that office got pushed around to different agencies and things like that. So no one was quite comfortable or quite sure what to do with a federal influence in education. By 1979, you had President Carter, and it was one of his campaign promises to create a department to kind of solidify this role, make it more efficient, bring together these different functions. And ever since then, you mentioned there's been a lot of discomfort with what they have put out. And, conservatives traditionally have been in the camp of let's reduce that, let's get rid of it. And every Republican presidential candidate has made some sort of promise or advocated for getting rid of the department, unsuccessfully, obviously, because that actually would be a heavy lift. But the desire is there, and I think it reflects constitutionally the right position. But also, and you mentioned this as well, practically speaking, we just haven't seen the results. After years of decades of, having different grant programs and funding streams that are intended for specific groups, we just haven't seen the gaps close. We haven't seen the achievement that was intended. And so overall, it's just not the most effective department.
So in the context of the debate or the discussion, rather, what are some of the pros and cons? If for some reason the folks who are trying to push this on the national level are successful, if they did get rid of the federal Department of Education, what would you see as the upside? What would you see as the downside? Kind of help us think through pros and cons as you see them with that step.
Yeah, I think at the very least, getting rid of the department, one of the major pros is sort of this symbolic win, or it shows a commitment to remove or prevent federal overreach. And then I think it has the possibility to do so. So if you were to get rid of the Department of Education, you still have federal policies in place, right? There are federal policies that existed long before the department ever came into creation. So you have, Title I funding was part of the war on poverty under President Johnson, and that came out in 1965. Or you had IDEA, which was by another name, but it was about 10 years later in 1975. The understanding we have about Title IX or race discrimination, all that predates the department, right? So you still have certain responsibilities created because of Congress passing laws that would still need to be overseen or protected, especially in the instance of civil rights. But those could be farmed out to more appropriate agencies that already deal with those sorts of issues rather than kind of housing them in one place. But overall, I think getting rid of it would be a way to actually ask the questions. Does this belong at the federal level, or does this belong at the state level? Does this belong with this agency, or does it belong with another? And I think that dismantling, that reorganization would be really healthy. The con, some might say that it would make it more difficult to help the kids that need it most. Again, I think somebody would push back and say that the department hasn't been very good at helping, improve test scores and things like that. So another con, maybe from a conservative perspective, I would say is more of a limitation, which is that federal policy, as I just listed some of those that existed before the department, could still be intrusive federal education policy. So you'd also have to analyze every step of the way. Are we just maintaining intrusive policies and farming them out, or are we actually doing that and then reducing the influence somehow? So I would say those are both things that would need to be looked at. Pros and cons, mostly a pro to get rid of it and to rethink that organization.
Before we move on from this, Christine, maybe one question that would be helpful for our listeners and viewers is, can you give just a really quick refresher on, for folks who are not familiar, what is sort of the core purpose and function of the Department of Education? What are the things it's doing today? I think that's probably a helpful foundation as people are seeing this issue in the news and trying to formulate their own thoughts. But what's just a quick kind of primer on the role of the department as it stands today?
Yeah, so it actually houses a lot of functions, arguably too many, but it still has that research arm. It has the Institute of Education Sciences. So for researchers, they're probably very familiar with this program office, the National Center for Education Statistics. It deals with grants and funding and policies that go along with that. It covers elementary, secondary, and post-secondary issues. So you have the Office of Federal Student Aid, which doles out billions, if not tens of billions, annually to students who are pursuing post-secondary education and training. So those are just the tip of the iceberg. I should also mention the Office of Civil Rights, right, which some argue could be housed in the Department of Justice. So it takes on a lot of functions, possibly, again, too many, and some of them I think are appropriate federal functions but could be used elsewhere.
That's very helpful. Thank you for that. I want to expand a little bit, kind of using the lens that you've outlined that we've been talking about on this episode of, again, if the underlying principle we're sort of after is federalism, is the federal government further empowering states to be able to create education policy that's beneficial for kids who are learning. But then the question is, okay, well, what can and should states do to empower parents and to help improve our education system? So there are a lot of things that you've been working on here at Sutherland. I wonder if you could just touch on some of those. And again, in this context of, it's not just, the Department of Education is the question. It's really, again, we have a new federal administration, a new Congress. Many states will have new leadership. Here in Utah, we'll have some new legislators in our legislature. So if we're thinking now in terms of, okay, there are some debates happening at the federal level, those are noteworthy, and we should be aware of those and see what is the principled lens we can bring to those debates and what the impact might be for the states. But then the broader and maybe to some extent more important question of, well, what should the education policy agenda for Utah in 2025 look like? And I wonder if there's a few things you can touch on that would kind of help flesh that out. If a legislator is listening to this and saying, well, whatever happens at the federal level, what are we doing in Utah? What should we be doing in Utah moving forward?
I think that's the right question to ask because, sort of regardless of who took office or who takes office in January, it's going to be the states that have to make a lot of these decisions. It's going to be those policies that impact students day to day almost immediately. So I think that, Utah has set a really important foundation of balance. We support public education. We support all types of choices, private choices. And I think that understanding of a parent-driven education, let the parents decide among a whole bunch of different options makes a ton of sense. And I think it's something that we can anticipate the state doing. If you're just looking at recent sources, House Speaker Schultz has said that they intend to expand education choice at the state level. So I think we can anticipate that. Sutherland has obviously been writing a lot about parent access to curriculum. Now, the state has done a lot in this area of increasing transparency on a number of different levels, financial, and the classroom level. But we've also been looking at ways to really tweak that and incentivize teachers to offer a little bit more to parents, potentially for like a financial incentive or employment protections and things like that, just to really take it to the next level. And part of that parent access to curriculum piece is also an awareness for parents of what already exists. There's a lot of great legislation and policy that is out there that maybe parents just aren't aware. Maybe there's an information gap. So putting that forward. And then in terms of education choice, it's such a broad term in reality, but choice within the public school system. So Utah has been a great leader in open enrollment, which is the ability to transfer from different schools or removing barriers that would make it hard to transfer different schools. And so increasing transparency around that, making it easier for parents to use those choices. So I think those would be big wins at the state level that are aligned with some of the things that Trump administration would try to do at the federal level, but I just think would be more effective even at the state level.
Is it kind of fair to say that the hope or sort of the call to action for folks on the federal level is, federal government, please kind of get out of the way and let states have more freedom and empowerment to do what they need to do?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the federal government, as I mentioned, there's some funding streams that have existed for decades, and those are very unlikely to go away. So then what do you do with what already exists? Well, you just increase flexibility, at the state level, put fewer strings attached, or where the funding already exists, move towards maybe education savings account like use on it and things like that. So, and then there's also discussion of, a federal Bill of Rights, which could create some redress for parents that feel that their parental rights have been violated, which could be, very strong and helpful as well. The states obviously are also trying to tackle parents' rights issues, and different pockets have done that. Utah has laid the groundwork for protections for parents as well in a number of different areas. But having that federal piece could also be appropriate as well.
I want to pinpoint something you said a second ago on what I kind of captured as sort of a three-pronged approach to the kinds of things that the state should do in terms of education policy. And you kind of couched it all under this idea of a parent-driven education. And you mentioned education choice, you mentioned parent access to learning materials, and then open enrollment. That again, they're all kind of, parents can be empowered to drive this. I want to phrase a question to you this way. If there's maybe a new legislator who has not served before, or someone who's been in but maybe is a little bit new to this issue, and if they were sitting down with you saying, okay, tell me why I as a policymaker should focus on these things, and is there one specific thing I ought to do this coming session? So basically in 2025, what are the specific priorities that policymakers should advance in those areas, especially again if you're talking to somebody who's maybe new to the issue? Kind of give them a sense of, well, here's the why, here's why this should be the focus, and here's the what of the things that the legislature could implement. Is there anything come to mind there that would be worth sharing with those folks?
Yeah, Utah has, as I mentioned, passed a lot of important bills, and it's kind of created this landscape where we understand that choice is important. I don't think we necessarily have to sell people on that. But the additional work, I think, is in making it functional and as successful as possible. So something like parent access to curriculum, somebody might say, hey, we have that. We already know what's going on in the classroom. Other parents might have a totally different experience. So an on-the-ground experience might be improved by incentivizing teachers to do more, right? And that could be that they're communicating with parents weekly. It could be that they're using a learning management system more effectively, and that they are compensated for doing that, because it takes time to do something like that if you're already, have a busy workload. Creating easy to use resources about what's taught over the course of a full year, not like a syllabus where you have to outline everything and it's rigid and you can't adapt to students, but kind of easy to understand content for parents. Ed choice expansion in some ways I think is fairly simple on the legislative side, adding more funding to a program that I think has a lot of potential, but also evaluating and making sure that entrepreneurs that are offering the education services, that the providers, that there is free to offer those choices to parents, then let the parents decide. Open enrollment, I mentioned Utah is this leader, but there's still a lot of information that's missing in terms of things that are already required. Certain data is supposed to be on different districts' websites, and oftentimes it's missing. A lot of that data isn't found at the state level. So I think that anything we can do just to take this to the next level, make it user-friendly, I think I would ask a legislator who's sitting down trying to figure out how to approach this and say, if you are a parent that's using the education system, or if you were, what more do you want to see? How could this be useful to you? What practical ways, what practical obstacles are in the way of you actually using choice or thinking about your options in a really broad way? So that's hopefully what the vision is there. I think it's going from good to great, or just getting better.
Christine, the last thing I want to ask you before we wrap up is kind of a magic wand question. If you could make anything happen on, let's say, the state level or the federal level, so kind of however you want to answer this, but over the next 4 years, what would be in your mind kind of the dream scenario? These are the education reforms that were successfully implemented nationally and at the state level. So 4 years from now, if we have this conversation again, you'd be able to look back and say, well, Nic, this is all the stuff that happened over the last 4 years, and it was amazing for kids and education. What would some of those things be?
Yeah, I think the ultimate principle that would guide this would be putting the proper functions of government in the right place, right? So federalism. I think there's so much potential with this new administration to get that right, to truly unwind some of these assumptions about what the federal government should do, and instead give flexibility, cut strings, reduce. To me, that might be one of the biggest wins. Obviously, the bully pulpit is incredibly useful, giving airtime to ideas. Supporting them, getting stories out there is key, and one of the key leadership roles that a president can play, or his secretary could play. At the state level, we have seen recently some I guess failures at the legislative level to pass education choice. So what I would hope is that some of those hurdles could be overcome. The policies that would match those states could come forward through compromise or whatever that could look like, so that we could just expand education choice. Again, I think that is sort of inevitable in a way. More and more parents are understanding that education choice makes sense. It's a constituency that I think just has to be reckoned with at this point in 2024, soon to be 2025. So that's what I would hope at the state levels, that we could kind of push past some of those barriers. But certainly, I think that would be a reflection of having the freedom and the space to do that without any interference from the federal government.
Christine Cooke Fairbanks, our Education Policy Fellow here at Sutherland. Thank you again for your time talking through all this with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being here.
And again, folks, go read her recent Insights blog piece on this issue. It's called Could Trump's Second Term Forever Change Education Policy? Federally. We'll, again, link to that in the show notes. Christine, thanks again. We're going to take a quick break before we leave you all with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, just a couple of things that stood out to me from this discussion. A helpful framework for thinking about education policy is this: the federal government should empower states, and states should empower parents. This accommodates important education principles like federalism, education choice, and parental involvement, which includes things like parent access to learning materials. You can learn a lot more about these ideas on Sutherland Institute's Education Issues page on our website, included in the show notes. That'll do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles or with a friend, family member, or coworker, whoever you think might find it interesting. Lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.